Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon, and of course this is the love song of the Scriptures. There have been a number of interpretations of this book, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. That is, it might be that 2 or 3 or 4 of these actually have a good applicability. The first one is the allegorical interpretation that sees the entire book as an allegory of the Lord's love for his people Israel. And certainly in the Old Testament there is that theme where Israel is the wife of the Lord, and there is that relationship, that love relationship that is supposed to be there, as well as that loyalty relationship. You'll remember that the entire book of Hosea presents that idea where Hosea and his marriage to his wife Gomer are acting out the part of God and Israel. The next interpretation is the cultic interpretation. Now, don't take that word cultic in a bad way. It just says that these are cultic or religious poems for use in the marriage ritual. And certainly we have seen examples, even in our modern day, of portions of the Song of Solomon being used perhaps in a wedding. The third interpretation, and this is the one with which I am going to take issue, this is the one with which I thoroughly disagree, but let me share it with you anyway. This is the shepherd interpretation that views Solomon as the villain of the story. It says this isn't a story between a guy and a gal, and that's wonderful, but rather there's the guy, there's the gal, and then there's evil Solomon who takes the girl and marries her, and then she goes running off to find her lover. Of course, that makes her an adulteress, so there's real problems with that story. And I have to say that it's really of a very recent innovation. This is a sort of a newfangled interpretation, but you might hear it out there somewhere. The next interpretation is much like the allegorical. This is the typical interpretation. Sees this as a type of the church, and just as the Old Testament pictures the relationship between the Lord and Israel in forms of a marriage, so likewise the New Testament does the same thing with Christ and the church, and describes the church as the bride of Christ, and Jesus as the bridegroom who's coming for his bride. The last interpretation, and this is the one to which I lean, although let me say I think we can also see some validity, at least an application of seeing it as a type and using it in marriage and seeing that allegory, but I lean toward the natural or literal interpretation that sees this as a series of love songs between a man and a woman. Now, the cast of characters, as I said, I'm not going to suggest there's 3 main characters, but rather there's 2. First of all, there's Solomon, Shalomo. The name means peaceful, and he's the guy in the story. The story is named after him. And then there's what I guess we could call Mrs. Solomon, the Shulamite, but that's just the feminine of Shalomo. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Solomon. The book begins, and let me give you this brief outline of where the story is going, and then we'll look at some of the details in it. The book begins with sort of a romance and a honeymoon. Boy meets girl, they fall in love, and it turns out he's the king. And he comes for his bride and takes her, and they go away on their honeymoon. But then in chapters 5 and 6, she wakes up and he's gone, and you get a hint. Marital problems is maybe a little bit too strong, but I'm saying that anyway. There's sort of, there's a longing for him and for her, and they're apart, but finally they get back together, and it's happily ever after, and so the story ends. That's the rough outline, very rough outline of the book. I'm not much of an opera fan, I have to confess, but I understand in opera there's sort of a storyline, but then there's the music, and yes, the music upholds the story, but really it's about the music. And I think that maybe that's a good analogy for the book Song of Solomon, in that in this book, yes, there seems to be sort of a loosely connected storyline, but it's really about the poetry, it's really about the love, it's really about the emotion, it's really about the song. But like I said, I think there is a story behind the song, so let's look at that story, and then we'll see maybe a bit of the song. The story begins where, there's the gal. She says, "I am black but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon." And it says, "Don't stare at me because I am swarthy or dark, for the sun has burned me." We're not talking necessarily somebody from Africa. This is a Jewish story, but she's been out in the sun a lot. For the sun has burned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard. Yeah. So notice that her own vineyard isn't a neighboring piece of land. She's talking about her own body. So there is a lot of figurative speech because this is poetry. And so we're going to expect quite a bit of this. I haven't taken care of myself. Notice my mother's sons were angry at me. There's maybe a sense where there's a little bit of division there. When our daughter was growing up and she did something wrong, my wife might say to her, "Your daughter did." Well, it's our daughter. We're a complete family there. But that statement made my mother's sons maybe as a hint that they're not really getting along, and they were angry with me, and they made me go out and work there, and I haven't been able to take care of myself as a result. So that mother's sons is maybe a hint that all is not all that great. So the story begins, and then the boy meets the girl. "Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions?" And everything is good, and then he goes off, but you get the sense there's a promise to return. And when he shows up, he returns not as a shepherd, but as the reigning king. You can see maybe why people are tempted to see this as an analogy or type of Christ, who came the first time as the humble, teaching, miracle-working rabbi, but returns again as the conquering king. And we have maybe shades of that here as well. As the story develops, Solomon takes his bride to Jerusalem, and she's in Jerusalem, and all is well. But there's a temporary separation, as we noted in chapters 5 and 6, where she goes out looking for him and at first can't find him. Maybe the palace is sort of big, or maybe he's off on king's business. That's not important to the story. What's important is the emotions and the love that's described. And eventually they come together and all is well. Now I want to give you some observations from the book. First of all, the name of Yahweh I don't think it's mentioned at all, or if it is, it's just in passing. Secondly, the book is never quoted in the New Testament, and I think that's an interesting observation. But I'm going to suggest there are some allusions to this book, that there are some uses of language that echo from this book, Song of Songs. It's been a long-standing tradition that the Jews of early times would not permit their young people to read this book. They thought of it, well, maybe a little bit R-rated. Maybe you need to already be grown up and be married, and because you don't want to engage your young ones in those sorts of thoughts before they're ready for them. Origen, the early church father, said, "I advise and counsel everyone who is not rid of the vexations of the flesh and blood, and has not ceased to feel the passion of his bodily nature, to refrain completely from reading this little book and the things that will be said about that." Actually, Origen, I think, would not have most of us read the book. I think maybe he was overstating things. As I said, I think there's some New Testament allusions. For example, a Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 12 says, "While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance." And I cannot help but think about that incident in the life of Christ, John chapter 12, verse 3, where Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. And I can't help but think, is John saying this in such a way where we are meant perhaps to think of the Song of Songs and remember that that's the story of the king. Likewise, Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 15, "You are a garden spring, a well of fresh water, and streams flowing from Lebanon." John chapter 7, verse 38, where Jesus stands up and says, "He who believes in me," as the scriptures said, "from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water." Jesus echoes perhaps is a better term, he echoes the words of the Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 2. I was asleep, but my heart was awake. A voice, my beloved, was knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. And you remember how in Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, you have this message of Jesus to one of the 7 churches, where Jesus says, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me. And there's a suggestion, perhaps he's wanting to come in and to be that lover, that darling, that one who delights in his church. Toward the end of the Song of Solomon, we have this ending, chapter 8, verse 6. Put me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy as severe as Sheol, that is the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame, here's that exception where Yahweh is mentioned, a very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, it would be utterly despised. And the point is that love is everything. That love is a wonderful thing, and it's a gift from God, and it is that in which we can delight. Okay, some lessons from the Song of Songs. First of all, I want you to notice that God is concerned with all of life, even our love life, even our passionate relations one with another. Secondly, God is concerned with our sexuality. This is a very, can I say it? This is a very sexy book. And God is concerned with that part of our life as well as all the other parts. And he wants us to do that which is right, to enjoy that which he's made, but in an appropriate way. All of life reflects our relationship with God, and that's why we can look at this book and we can see analogies with God and Israel in the Old Testament. We can see analogies with Christ and the church in the New Testament, because those things reflect our relationship with God. And even our sexuality, even our love life reflects our relationship with God. I think it's neat that the scriptures contain love songs. That God is interested in our love life. As one who's been married for 40 plus years, I'm deeply in love with my wife. And that's a good thing. That's something that is commended by the scriptures. And finally, I want you to notice that we, all of us, are part of a sacred romance, because God has wooed us. He has come after us. He's expressed his love for us, and he wants that deepest relationship with us. And he presents it, he provides it through his Son, Jesus Christ, who died in our place. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would enter into that kind of relationship, would have eternal life. And I hope you have entered into that sacred romance too.